Dear learners, I am Christina Georgy, your academic counselor for the MEG program, and I welcome you to my session. As per the request of a few students who are fasting, I will be recording this session. Yes. So before proceeding further, let me make this clear that this is a specialized session specifically designed for the MEG learners. All the aspects discussed in this session will be specifically based on the MEG-05 official study material. So in our previous session, we have seen some of the critical aspects based on literature, criticism and theory. So today we will focus our attention towards an overview of the Western critical thought. So if you are wondering where this falls in your study material, this falls under Unit 2 of Block 1 of your official IGNOU study material for MEG-05. So this unit is very crucial in the sense this is more or less a summary of what we are learning as part of blocks 2 and 3. Hence, if you have better clarity regarding this unit, it will further assist you in your study of the next two blocks. So, an overview of the Western critical thought. So, very often we find that most of our learners are not very comfortable with this particular paper on literary criticism and theory. Have you ever wondered why? One of the most significant reasons could be that the other papers of your MEG course are rich in poetry, prose, drama, etc. And that would inevitably raise or arouse some level of interest in the learners. And moreover, some learners even find those genres much more easier to understand, to comprehend and reproduce during their TEEs. But this particular paper, MEG-05, titled Literary Criticism and Theory, is all about literary theories, literary critics and their criticisms. Hence, you need to pay much attention towards what is discussed in class. This unit would help you refresh all your thoughts and ideas on the Western critical thought. Additionally, we will also meet a few other new critics and their concepts and notions in course of time. So, let me remind you that we are concerned here mostly with the Western critical thought, not the Eastern. That falls under the unit titled Indian Aesthetics. We will deal with that separately. Here, it is all about the Western critical thought. Then again, the Western thought has a better supremacy over the Eastern thought. We will discuss that later. So, here, critical thought derives from general aesthetics and is in turn guided by philosophical debates and ideas about what really is God and the possibility of absolute knowledge. So, it is in fact very evident that there has been a connection between philosophical thought and critical thought. There has also been a correspondence, a relation between the pagan and Christian concepts such as that of word and logos. So here comes the question, are you aware of the term pagan? Are you aware of the term pagan? Anybody? You must have studied some poetry or some other aspects where this term must have come up. P-A-G-E-N. So basically, a pagan is a person who holds religious beliefs other than the main world religions. It also could be put in simple terms as if the non-Christian beliefs. Basically, these pagans believe that nature is sacred. And it is also significant that the pagans worshipped nature and earth. So, rather than worshipping a god, these pagans used to worship nature and God. So, pagans would be a total opposite from those Christian beliefs. Okay. So, these could be like two binaries. Okay. So, word was the pagan concept and the Christian concept was logos. You must be familiar to this word logos. In the beginning was the word, and the word was with God. This is a few verses. These are a few verses from the Holy Bible. It's a Christian belief. So this would serve as a basic introduction. This is also mentioned as part of section 2.1 of our study material. Now moving on to some of the classical heroes. What do you mean by classics? Classical heroes would be those heroes who stands out in history, right? Yes. So some very early Greek poets also show an awareness of critical theory or practice. They include famous poets such as Homer, Milton, etc. For example, these people, Homer or Milton, used to begin their epics with an invocation to the muse. You must have studied during your BA days, and this would help them write with the help of divine inspiration. So all these are known to as nothing new. Then between Homer and Plato, considered to be the first conscious theoretician of literature, centuries passed by. There came many other theoreticians, poets and notable classical heroes such as Hesiod, Pindar, and these writers made critical remarks in literary history. Aristophanes, I am not very sure whether you are aware of this person. If you have studied history of English language and literature for your BA course, you must be aware of Aristophanes, and he was very famous for his plays that used dialogues dealing with the subject of literature. So the question is, what psychological processes contribute to the reader's understanding or enjoyment of literary texts? So the further aspects in this unit will focus on the various strands of Western critical thought. So now, can you name a few people? This would be a very obvious question. Can you name a few people whose names come to your mind whenever you think of Western critical thought? I'm not using specific terms so that you wouldn't be given clue regarding the answer. Some of the pregnant figures, yes, obviously we discussed this last class also, Plato, and without much ado you should also think of Aristotle. Good, very good. Yeah, alright, yes. So I'll help you out with the basic outline. Plato's parable. Before we see, this falls under section 2.1.2. Before we move on to Plato's parable as such, let's brush up our notions on Plato. He was an Athenian philosopher during the classical period in ancient Greece. He was the teacher of Aristotle, I hope you remember. And what do you mean by Plato's parable? Parable, the term, any idea what does that mean? This term is also seen in the Holy Bible, parable. Parable is a simple story used to illustrate a moral as told by Jesus in Gospel. Yes, Divya, it is a story, but it has more dimensions to it. It is a simple story used to illustrate a moral as told by Jesus in Gospel. In Malayalam we say upama. Okay, that is parable. So let's have a look at what Plato's parable is. There was this professor of philosophy at Harvard University, Alfred North Whitehead, and he once called all of Western philosophy a footnote to Plato. So that itself shows the magnificence of this particular critic Plato. The same is true of literary criticism. Most readers of Plato turn to the Republic to find Plato's opinions about literature. So what do you mean by the Republic? This is a very important work written by Plato. Some other books written by Plato include Symposium, Phaedrus, etc. Remember the Republic. You will have to quote this as and when required when you are attempting your TEE. When you write the title, make sure that you capitalize the first word, the first alphabet of the first word, that is the content words. If you are not very sure regarding capitalization, do refer to the video that I have forwarded. So Plato wrote that the ideal state according to him is divided into three classes. Which are these three classes? 1. The artisans, 2. The military, and 3. The philosophers. So these three were in charge of specific things. It is according to Plato's ideal state. So the philosophers are in charge of ruling the state. So what does the military do? They were charged with defending it. Defending what? Defending the state. And the artisans with sustaining it physically. The philosophers are in charge of ruling the state, the military with defending it, and the artisans with sustaining it physically. So he opines that artisans and the military like poetry, but it is contrary to the nature of philosophy and therefore bad for the state. And he even says that poets should be either exiled or have their energy rechanneled into more productive areas. This is very important. This falls under the second paragraph of section 2.1.2. If you are referring to your study material at the moment, you may mark this as well. This is very important, Plato's concepts. Alright, so what does he say? He says that the artisans and the military like poetry, but it is contrary to the nature of philosophy. It is opposite to the nature of philosophy. And he also says that this is bad for the state. What? Poetry is bad for the state, and poets should be either exiled or have their energy rechanneled into more productive areas. He also says that only hymns of praise to the gods and in tribute to famous and virtuous men can poetry be productive. In two ways. Way 1, hymns of praise, songs to God, or poetry sung in tribute to famous and virtuous men. It is important to remember two things that Plato has put forth. First of all, the Republic is in verse form. What do you mean by verse form? It is written in form of words like poetry and is neither hymn to gods nor a tribute to a famous man. He himself said that poetry should either be a hymn of praise or sung as a tribute to famous and virtuous men. But his own Republic, although it is in verse form, it is neither a hymn to God nor a tribute to a famous man. Secondly, you should remember that Plato is using the ideal state as a metaphor. Need to have specific clarity regarding what metaphor and other figures of speech are. If you are not aware of all these, please do revise. I have also sent you I think a prelude to poetry. In that also you can refer to all these concepts. Alright, yes. So Plato is using the ideal state as a metaphor for the mind of the virtuous man. Metaphor for the mind of the virtuous man, with the three classes symbolizing the tripartite soul. This is also a very important concept, the tripartite soul. So according to Plato, reason exists so that we may transcend the baser needs of the appetites and the spirit. So Plato did not actually advocate exiling poets, as we must have thought, but he meant that the truly enlightened person would not need or want poetry, and furthermore that poetry can keep us from becoming such a person by feeding the spirit and appetites while holding reason in check. It is also important to remember that Plato compared poets to madmen and seemed to believe that their madness was contagious. See, so far we haven't discussed any new point apart from what you have already studied for your BA syllabus. So my simple suggestion towards your betterment is that if you are not remembering all these points that you have already studied for your BA days, make sure that you refer to that text that you have studied. Because I personally believe that if you go through a familiar text, it would be much more easier for you to understand. Nevertheless, you should come back and refer to our study material for clarity so that you won't miss out any points for our TE. Do you follow me? Can I have some level of response? Yes, thank you. So in short, we can summarize that Plato definitely believed that poetry had power and that power made people want to imitate what they saw in art. So there came the word imitation. Do you know an alternative word that would represent imitation? Yes, wonderful, I appreciate that. So from now on, you wouldn't just write imitation but also mimesis, at least in brackets, because this is the key term. Never ever forget to write the key terms, for they are very much important. Alright. So according to Plato, the nature of the universe is mimesis or imitation. Remember, Plato was an idealist. What do you mean by an idealist? See, in Malayalam we say Adarshavadi, right? Yes. So according to Plato, he believed that reality consists of various layers. The top layer is made up of ideas, and all lower levels imitate those ideas. At the top is the original idea, and towards the bottom we move towards the imitated ideas. Actually, according to Plato, the top level is made up of one idea, the good, and that all things and ideas only existed as they participated in the good. The good was the ultimate reality. Hence what happens? The further one got from the good, the further one was from reality, and the deeper into evil. At the top, the good, and at the bottom, there is evil. I will also explain that. Here is an example. Suppose, take the case of a chair. A chair is made up of a series of accidents. For instance, it could be brown and mostly soft. Obviously, it has wheels on it, and to some extent in most chairs, its height can also be adjusted. So what makes a chair a real chair is that it imitates the form of a chair. All chairs, no matter what accidents might make up their existence, have essential chairness. In short, only the chair, the concept is real, and whatever we see is an imitation of the real chair. That is what he mentions. So if we move on to the further considerations of Plato, in his Ion, it is yet another work by Plato. He ascribes dialogues pertaining to literary theories to Socrates and the rhapsode. See, rhapsode is also a familiar concept. If you are not familiar, you may please brush up the idea. A rhapsode can be described as a cross between the modern day university or call a lecturer and actor. Okay, it's such a simple idea. And poetry deals with a variety of motives and feelings, not all of which are desirable. Some might be desirable, some would not be desirable. The feelings could hence be both good and bad. Feelings could produce pleasure, whereas bad feelings could produce pain. Also, poetry deals with fictitious incidents and characters. Plato even gives the example of Homer and Hesiod and the Greek dramatic poets who do not always represent God as wholly good, but these gods are man-like. So if you look at the writings of Homer, Hesiod and the Greek dramatic poets and the tradition, they were of the impression that God should not be produced or represented as truly good, but in a man-like way. Quarrelsome, deceitful and even fallible. So their heroes are emotional or even unheroic, hence were more realistic. In this context, Plato mentions his concept of mimesis. He develops this idea at different places in the Republic. Please do remember this. The concept of mimesis has been developed by Plato in his work, The Republic. It is not just Republic, The Republic. As I mentioned, Plato's dialogues are very famous and they have been criticized and studied ever since they were written. More recently, Plato's dialogues on love have been seen as the earliest impulse on a love between men, which some modernists called Greek love. You must have heard about this Greek love, the concept. We can also say that queer theory has renewed this attention on Platonic love. You must have heard of this term Platonic love, right? That is relationship between human beings in which sexual intercourse is neither desired nor practiced. And this is seen usually in heterosexuals. So if you are wondering what queer theory is, Queer. Queer theory in fact emerged in the 1980s, hence we say it's much more recent in origin, and it is a lens used to explore and challenge how scholars and the media penetrate gender and sex-based binaries. And it is an umbrella term. This queer is an umbrella term that would comprise of all the alternative sexualities such as LGBTQ and much more. Alright? Yes, and these days LGBTQ studies are also into prominence. So we can say that this Platonic love and these dialogues of Plato in a way inspired or provided an impulse towards such readings in the future. Is that clear? Yes, thank you. So far we have discussed an introduction to Western critical thought. Thereafter we discussed why the Western critical thoughts are much not into discussion among our learners, and we also saw the correspondence between the pagan and Christian concept of word and logos. We discussed some classical heroes such as Homer, Milton, Hesiod, etc. And we discussed the transition, and finally we came to Plato and his notion of the ideal state, how it is divided into three classes, and some of the most notable aspects that he has put forth in the Republic, such as the tripartite soul. So this concept of tripartite soul is very important, and Plato was an idealist. Do remember how he put forth the concept of mimesis, that is the concept of imitation, the good at the top and evil at the bottom. And remember the example of chair that I mentioned, and his further considerations such as that put forth in the iron. And remember that he deals with a variety of motives and feelings. Some of them are desirable, the bad ones cause pain, but the good ones are pleasurable indeed. And he mentions the concept of mimesis in his The Republic, remember that, and the concept of Platonic love and its relation with the queer theory. With that, we come to the end of our discussion on Plato. Remember, the extended version of this is seen in block 2. So when you prepare for your TEE, you just need to have a combined study of what is mentioned here along with the elaborate discussion on block 2. If they ask you a question regarding Plato, never ever limit your answer with whatever we have discussed so far. In block 2, there are much more. It's a vast ocean. Shall we move on to Aristotle? Yes, glad. Thank you for your response also. So Aristotle was a student of whom? Let me see whether you remember. Yes, I am happy to see the response. Aristotle also had a student. Do you know who that is? Have you heard of Alexander the Great? So Aristotle was the teacher of Alexander the Great. So we can say Alexander the Great was a student of Aristotle. So speaking more about him, he was the founder of Lyceum, the school of philosophy. The school of philosophy founded by Aristotle is Lyceum. Aristotle would be recognized as a Greek philosopher during the classical period in ancient Greece. Alright. So, although Aristotle's theories differed from Plato's, we could say that most of them were also dependent on Plato's theories. Like Plato, Aristotle was also an idealist. And he also, like Plato, sees art as imitative. But there is a difference. Unlike Plato, Aristotle sees it as imitating essence rather than accidents. There, Plato was referring to this accidents aspect, but here Plato believes that it is imitating essence rather than accidents. Therefore, according to Aristotle, art is actually higher on the chain than the empirical world and elevates rather than lowers us. That was his conception. Then Aristotle wrote a very significant work to describe the various forms of the various arts. Any idea which that particular work is? Are you sure? Oh, glad. So I am very glad that most of you have written the correct answer. Poetics. It is not the poetics, it is simply poetics. Alright. So apart from poetics, there are some other significant books written by Aristotle. So if you need to have an idea, I will just tell those names. Rhetoric, metaphysics and poetics. Just remember these, it would be fine. I told you these in order to write as if an introduction to Aristotle if there is a question from Aristotle for your TEE. So regarding Aristotle and his conception of tragedy, see, this is a very important topic. As part of block 2, I have elaborately discussed this. Never ever go for TEE without studying Aristotle and his conception of tragedy. It is probably a very sure question for your TEE. Alright? Yes. So I elaborate on what is mentioned as part of this unit. Alright? Yes. So he describes tragedy in terms of its 4 causes. There are 4 causes according to Aristotle. Cause 1, material cause, 2, the formal cause, 3, the efficient cause, and 4, the evocation of fear and pity. Aristotle describes tragedy in terms of 4 causes. First is the material cause. It refers to words and gestures. As we have studied, these tragedy can be broken down into 6 elements. Which are the 6 elements of a tragedy? Plot, character, thought, diction, spectacle and song. Next comes the formal cause. The formal cause is the action which belongs to both epic and history. The presentation of action is the formal cause. Then comes the efficient cause, which is inevitably the playwright, one who writes the play, and comes the most important cause, the final cause, that is the evocation of fear and pity for the purpose of purgation. That term purgation is a key word. Never ever leave out that word. Tragedy makes us feel bad so that we can get those feelings out of our system. So this is not yet mentioned in the textbook, but I would like to ask you whether you are familiar with a term that is very prominently used in this concept. I mean used in this context. Yes. Oh, as if you are waiting to, yeah, I appreciate your presence of mind. So here comes how purgation takes place in an individual. I can explain that with the help of an example. That is, when the audience is watching a performance, each member among the audience feels repelled by the hero's relationship that is portrayed, and hence he or she, the audience, might identify with the hero and the tragedy that is portrayed on screen or on stage. So, you would be having an idea what I am about to say. Of course, the tragedy of Oedipus. Are you aware of Oedipus? Greek mythology, the story of Oedipus. Do you know that story? Yes, I hope most of you are aware of that. If at all there are people who are not much familiar, I give you a brief overview. Just a brief overview I will be able to give you at the moment. In Greek mythology, Oedipus is a character written by the Greek playwright Sophocles. So, Oedipus was the king of Thebes who unknowingly and unwantedly and unintentionally killed his own father and married his own mother. So that was something very shocking for the audience to actually see with their own eyes. So hence, when the audience watched such a performance of Oedipus Rex, that is the name of the play, Oedipus Rex by Sophocles, each member of the audience felt repelled by Oedipus' relationship with his mother, and they were in fact horrified when he blinded himself, and hence the audience began to pity him for his helpless plight. If you are wondering why he blinded himself, it was because at the end of the play, once he got to know that he did such an offense by killing his own father and marrying his own mother, he was overpowered with guilt and he punished himself by self-blinding himself. Okay, so that was really tragic, and each of these feelings experienced by the audience is an unhealthy part of the viewer's emotional state. But what happens is that in undergoing the emotional experience, he or she, each individual among the audience, gets rid of the unhealthy emotions, however temporarily, thus ensuring and restoring emotional balance and health. So the metaphor that Aristotle uses is that of a purgative. What do you mean by a purgative? In medical parlance, purgative has a significant meaning. Do you know? We can say these are basically laxatives. Yes, the purpose is to cleanse, especially by causing evacuation of the bowels. So these are purgatives. So this situation, this projection of the play, this tragedy would serve as a purgative in the minds of the audience. That is what he has been explaining. Yes. So it would appear that Aristotle was a great admirer of the Oedipus plays, and he was inspired by Sophocles. Hence he made use of this example in order to explain the concept of catharsis, purgation of emotions, that is catharsis. So Aristotle also described the plot of tragedy in such clear terms that learners still learn the Aristotelian plot line in graduate and postgraduate classes. You must have studied for your BADs. For our MA syllabus, there is no elaboration of this, but just a mention of this plot line, which include exposition, rising action, climax, denouncement and falling action. It is like an inverted V. At the bottom there is exposition, then there is rising action, at the top there is climax, then it comes down, denouncement, and at the very bottom there is falling action. You just have to know about this. We don't have this for detailed study. That's all that is mentioned in this unit regarding Aristotle, but I would also like to remind you that there are certain concepts put forth by Aristotle, such as hamartia. Do you know what hamartia is? Hamartia. Correct. Hamartia refers to the tragic flow of the hero. Okay, the tragic hero. See, for that matter, Shakespearean tragedies are often put into use. That is, are you aware of the 4 greatest tragedies by Shakespeare? The 4 greatest tragedies. Hamlet, correct. Othello, correct. Apart from Hamlet and Othello, do you know anything else? Yes, wonderful. Macbeth. You should never forget Macbeth. Yeah, and there is one more. Romeo and Juliet is not considered as. Yes, Pratibha. She has texted the correct answer. Just now you have also texted the right answers. There are 4 great Shakespearean tragedies: Hamlet, Othello, King Lear and Macbeth. So did you know these? If not, it would be great if you could remember. See, the way I try to remember is by making use of an acronym. The acronym that I make use of is HOKM. I've typed that in the chat box. So H stands for Hamlet, O stands for Othello, K stands for King Lear and M stands for Macbeth. Moving on to section 2.1.5, Aquinas, Longinus and Dante. You must have heard of these names even though you are not much familiar with these names. So, these are notable figures in the history of English criticism. Dante Alighieri, that is the full name, you must have studied as part of HELL, History of English Language and Literature. Do you know his one notable work? DC. How do you expand that? Are you aware of it? Dante's work. Yes, wonderful. Yeah, this is also mentioned in our study material, so remember that work. Divine Comedy. So Dante took Aquinas' ideas and showed how they might be applied to secular texts such as his own Divine Comedy. Longinus, he seems to write largely to refute Plato's disdain of poetry. So he argued against Plato's disregard of poetry. Can you give me one concept put forth by Longinus? If you don't know that, that would be a shame if you have studied BA English. Longinus and his concept of, concept of, it's partly true, on the concept of sublimity. Okay, On the Sublime is the name of the work written by him. The concept is named sublimity, and the other answer was also correct. It refers to transcendence. That is something that transcends greatness or beauty for the observer. That is known as the concept of sublimity. So his work on the sublime deals first and foremost with the idea of transcendence. So in other words, what makes a work great is that it takes over our heads and makes us see things that are not there. Okay, ഒരു sublime feeling ഉണ്ടാക്കുക എന്ന് പറയും. So Longinus work is all about how to maximize, transport or elevate ideas. So that is important. You must have having an idea regarding that. So there are 2 characteristics of the sublime. These are the ability to think great thoughts and the ability to feel powerful emotions. To think great thoughts and to feel powerful emotions. These are important, just keep that in mind. The poet must be properly able to form figures, and this seems to be more than simple characterization since he refers to figures of thoughts or expression. Just leave those things, just focus on the most important aspects. Anyway, there won't be any short questions for that matter on Aquinas, Longinus and Dante. If at all you will have to present these ideas, it would just be in case if they ask you to present an overview of the Western critical thought, or else this area wouldn't be of great relevance with respect to your TE. With respect to literary criticism, of course, it's of great magnitude and importance, but with respect to our exam preparation, you just have to mention these names and the most important aspects put forth by him. And regarding Aquinas, he is very much related to the clergy and the Bible. According to him, there were two ways to know God, the Bible and the book of the world. As for the interpretation of the Bible, he suggested that any passage could be read both literary and allegorically, and that allegorical readings could be broken into three types. Type 1 allegory, type 2 moral, type 3 anagogic. That is, allegory would be correspondence to ordinary life, moral would refer to behavioral message, and anagogic would deal with the eternal varieties and glory of God. Just keep that in mind. He was much more related to Christianity. Basically, he was an Italian philosopher. He was a Catholic priest who Aquinas, and also an influential philosopher. So, if some of you were wondering what allegory is, the basic thought would be, I've heard of this word allegory, but I don't remember what an allegory is. See, basically, allegory could be interpreted to reveal a hidden meaning, typically a moral or political meaning. That is what is meant by that. So, if you need clarity, you can revise your ideas, your understanding of the prelude to poetry. I think that would do. Now, let's proceed to the English tradition. There comes a very notable English poet, Soldier. When you think of poet Soldier, what would be the name that comes to your mind? Philip, can you complete it? Philip? Sidney. Good. But then again, let me suggest, like I already see, people write different spellings for Sidney. So, I am mentioning this so that at this very moment itself you will be aware of this. Okay. So, once you are aware, you wouldn't make mistake. That is what I believe. Unless you are aware of this, you would repeatedly make mistakes regarding spellings. So, this is a common mistake. Philip Sidney, many of the students make mistake. So, he was one of the prominent figures of the Elizabethan age. And can you tell me a few works written by Philip Sidney? You wouldn't have passed BA if you have not studied Sidney. Yes, we will discuss Sidney and his concepts. So, Sidney, Sir Philip Sidney, why is he having such a prefix? It is because he has received the knighthood. Sir Philip Sidney, he was truly the typical Renaissance man, and he has written some notable works such as the Defense of Poesy, then Apology for Poetry. That is the most important work. Yes, good. Never forget that, Apology for Poetry. I told you he was a soldier, right? Yeah, so he died in the Battle of Zutphen, Zutphen. That would be an additional information if you are interested in knowing more about him. Other works from him include Astrophil and Stella, published in 1591, Arcadia, published in 1580, The Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia, if I remember, that is the full title. Yes. So, you must have heard of these works, maybe you don't remember at the moment, no problem, you can always revise and re-revise. So, I told you one important work, Apology for Poetry. In this particular work, he draws heavily upon classical authors, including Cicero and Quintilian. Just keep that in mind. And he writes in the form of the 8-part classical oration. There wouldn't be a separate question on Sidney, very probably, because all your questions are essay questions for 20 marks each. Nevertheless, if you are asked to write an essay on the Western critical overview, you should inevitably mention Philip Sidney. And when you mention him, this is the most important aspect that you will be writing about, the 8-part classical oration. So, I will give you the names of these parts. So, the first one, exordium, refers to the attention getter, whereas the second one, narratio, refers to the history of the question. The third, propositio, refers to the answer to the question. Partitio, the breakdown of the answer. Confirmation proves the answer on its own merits. Then refutatio refutes counter arguments. Digressio talks about implications and related topics, and finally peroratio concludes the arguments and stirs the blood. So that is something of great importance. Just have an understanding of that. Then Sidney begins with some general statements about human culture in this particular work. First of all human cultures are a blend of art and utility. That is important, just underline. The second thing is that poetry is of prime importance in all cultures, in all times. So this falls under section 2.2.1 on Sidney, third paragraph. Okay. So Sidney says that poetry is more important than philosophy. According to him, poetry greater than philosophy, as philosophy cannot steer men towards virtuous action as poetry can. That is, he means that poetry can steer men towards virtuous action, but philosophy cannot. He also says that philosophy is so concerned with universals that it will never down to earth. History must concern itself with the particulars of human existence, and he believes that poetry blends the universal and the particular. Yeah, that is one aspect to be taken care of. So just remember, these are the ideas put forth by him. You just have to remember. So regarding this work, Apology for Poetry, we discussed. There is also another work, The Defense of Poetry, written in 1580 and published in 1591. You must have studied this for BA, I am very sure. So here in this work, he defends poetry against the accusations made by another writer. Can you give me the name of that writer? That person or those persons would be highly knowledgeable because that name is not mentioned in the text at the moment. Let me see. The first name is Stephen. The second name starts with the alphabet G and ends with N. And this person is a satirist, and he attacked poetry on 4 grounds. Stephen Gosson, Gosson. The 4 grounds of attacks put forth by Stephen Gosson: 1. Poetry is useless. 2. Poetry is the mother of all lies. 3. Poetry is immoral. And the 4th is regarding how Plato banished poets from his republic. You don't have to study, I just mentioned. I thought some of you must be remembering. If you don't remember, not at all a problem. So moving on to some philosophical foundations, there we see some German philosophers. German Romanticism was a response to Scientism, and the most lyrical and the most visionary of the German theoreticians were Friedrich von Haydenberg, and his essay Christendom or Europe is also noteworthy. Then there is Immanuel Kant. I am very sure that you are aware of Immanuel Kant. He and his Copernican revolution is also of high significance. The term Copernican revolution is used to refer to any major epistemological shift in the history of ideas. So if you need further clarity, please do read that section on philosophical foundations. Now we conclude with some aspects on early Romanticism. So the American and French revolutions, you are aware of those, right? So these revolutions stand in the political background of early Romantic thinkers. I am very sure that you can think of those early Romantic thinkers. Who are they? Early Romantic thinkers. You should be able to ask this at any moment, even during sleep. I remember when we were students of literature, we were, in a situation to even recite the definition of poetry put forth by one of these. Yes, correct. Wordsworth and Coleridge. Yes. Do you know the definition of poetry? Poetry, I got, is a spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions recollected in tranquility, unquote. I am very sure you must also have studied this. So these are certain aspects in literature that you should never forget. Yeah, with constant revision it's possible. So the aristocracies that had previously controlled Europe were falling. There were some situational changes in the socio-political scenario of Europe. The middle class was growing. They began to read, and power was increasingly shifting to the common people. Even common people were educated and they started to read. So this makes perfect sense then. That Wordsworth poetry and his criticism of poetry should be aimed at the common man. That is one significant aspect. Apart from other romantics or apart from other writers of those times, Wordsworth's poetry was written for the common man rather than for the educated aristocrats. So for Wordsworth and Coleridge, this Romanticism meant a turn away from elevated language and subject matter. Just because they wrote for the common people, they turned away from lofty language and subject matter, and they turned towards spontaneity and emotion. So basically these would be the characteristics of Romanticism. Which are they? Turning away from elevated language and subject matter, use of spontaneity, emphasis on emotion, etc. So the Romantics in general believed that a poet was born with a great soul and that ordinary language was the proper vehicle for the communication of that soul. So basically the Romantics of those times believed that they were poets, a man speaking to men, a common man speaking to common men. Especially for Wordsworth, this meant rural and pastoral language. Rural and pastoral language. He believed that the most important knowledge came from communing with nature. But for Coleridge, it simply meant the language spoken by most people at ordinary times. So you need to remember the characteristics of Romanticism. It is elaborated as part of block 3. Nevertheless, let me just put those in order to refresh your memories. Elevated language and subject matter, emphasis on spontaneity and emotions, turn towards the rustic and rural and pastoral life and language, and they believe that they are men speaking to men. The poet was a man speaking to men. So another major shift that took place is the aim of poetry. Earlier, they had considered poetry to exist in order to change people's behavior, but as ages passed by, the Romantics threw that out of the window. In the sense, they were not following the same aspect. According to the Romantics, poetry existed purely as a form of expression, particularly the expression of intense emotion. Hence, Wordsworth's classic definition of poetry as, I quote, emotion recollected in tranquility, unquote. What a beautiful way to end the session. The exact full definition is that, according to Wordsworth, poetry is, I quote, a spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions recollected in tranquility. On that note, let's just quickly rewind what we have discussed. I have already revised those aspects of Plato. Now, after discussing Plato, we moved on to Aristotle. He was a teacher of Alexander the Great, the student of Plato. He founded the Lyceum, School of Philosophy. He was a Greek philosopher during the classical age. His noteworthy work was Poetics, and we discussed all relevant aspects regarding catharsis, purgation of emotions, elements of tragedy, plot of tragedy, hamartia, and other relevant aspects. Please make sure that you go refer to block 3. I have forwarded my lecture also. If you get time, if interested, you may refer to that, or else read your official study material. That would be enough. Then we discussed Aquinas, Longinus, Dante. We moved on to the English tradition where we saw Philip Sidney, the English poet, scholar and soldier, and his notions were also discussed. Later we saw some philosophical foundations and moved on to some aspects regarding early Romanticism, where importance was ascribed to two noteworthy literary critics of the Romantic era, who were they? Wordsworth and Coleridge. With that, we come to the end of our discussion on an overview of Western critical thought. I hope you have understood this session.